Okay, so we've got people calling from on the Jack Jones from Mark, and Sunny Exeter and Croydon. And as I say, do put in any favourite Cockney phrases where you're calling from and so on. So getting our show on the road. Just wait for one or two more people to come in the room, and we'll get the event underway. Okay, so really just a sort of bit of background about why we're here and what we're about. So Modern Cockney, our mission really is to enable anyone with an affinity with non-posh Londoners. Hello, so someone, Nigel, do you want to take care of them? Nigel's our doorman today, so anyway, so just to repeat there that our mission really of Modern Cockney is to enable anyone with an affinity with being a non-posh Londoner, a phrase first coined by the comedian Arthur Smith, to connect with more inspiring stories and narratives about themselves based on positive, inclusive values. And with this, we believe, creates a very powerful resource for overcoming adversity, tackling social prejudice, and building greater togetherness and social cohesion. And our mission, as I say, is to create opportunities for that. And our backstory, so some over 10 years or more ago, there was a story about Cockney disappearing from the streets of London. That led to a webinar that I started on that subject, where I met Saif from the Bengali East End Heritage Society, who's here today. And I run a social enterprise called Grow Social Capital, and together we created Modern Cockney and the Modern Cockney Festival. And we're really sort of sharing this in an age where social identities are more complex. So we're not saying go around saying I am necessarily Cockney, but you know, we may have a wardrobe of identities to call upon. So I, for example, consider myself Cockney British. Saif, I know, calls himself Sylheti Cockney. So it's really a case of saying that there's a danger, if you notice on that sign, that Cockney really sort of was marginalised and ignored in any sort of debate about modern identity. So our really effort is to sort of restore the balance and really take asset of this tremendous opportunity we've got with great pride in our heritage. And in our work, we realise there's a lot of sort of complexities and contradictions even with a Cockney identity. So we began an exercise, created the Cockney formula, which is 52 different variables, and you can see it's bloody complicated. But we like the simple definition of adapting the Bow Bells message of Bow Bells are heard through the heart. It really goes to the emotional connection of the original meaning to the identity. So anyone who's got an affinity with a non-posh Londoner, I would say, and it's actually Cockney's more complex. So we've got old school, which perhaps someone like me might be labelled as, so characterised by, say, things like using rhyming, slang, and various other stereotypes there. New school Cockney, new communities of people coming into London and the southeast over the last 50 years. And again, the ever evolving story of Cockney is one of learning, adapting, and every new arrival leaving their imprint on an ongoing identity. And we have what's called the Cockney diaspora, which Saif called the Cockneydom, a region defined by the spread of pie mash shops. So if you've got a pie mash shop, that's a good indicator then that you know, there's a Cockney affinity with the culture. And lastly, there's sort of a Cockney ancestral. So even though you might ostensibly be very posh, you don't get much posher than people like Charles Dance and Helen Mirren. Their parents were Cockneys, and so that spirit of identity still lives within them as an inspiring source. But today we've got two guest speakers from the field of sociolinguistics, and we're exploring issues around about sort of linguistics and identity, and also issues about social prejudice. So if I can maybe stop the share there and introduce our first speaker, Alice Paver, who's going to be followed by Dr. Christopher Strelluf. Alice, would you like to unmute yourself and welcome you to today's event?
Yes, thanks so much for having me. Hi. So,
from Alice?
I'm in Cambridge at the moment, and don't personally really have any kind of links to Cockney other than my research interests, really.
Yeah. As I say, we're welcoming. We're a very welcoming tribe, the Cockneys. So welcoming. Tell us, so sociolinguists. We've got some people in the room who may not be familiar with the subject. I mean, if you had to explain to like an elderly relative or someone what a bit of ageism there, apologies. if it has explain what sociolinguistics is, how would you explain it? How do you explain your day job?
It's really the study of variation in language and how that can signal different parts of our identity. How does the variation align with, say, for example, our region that we grew up in, our race or ethnicity, our age, our gender, things like that. So sociolinguists are interested in how does speech, not just sounds, but also words, vary amongst different groups of people according to different parts of their identity, and also other things like particularly what I'm interested in, which is attitudes about different variation in speech, particularly regional accents.
Yeah. And what made you interested in the subject? I
mean, well, that's a good question. I think it's partially because I was very lucky to grow up living all over the world. My dad's actually a member of the diplomatic service, so I was brought up in a sort of environment where I encountered people from lots of different cultures, people speaking English and other languages in various different ways. Part of the interest, though, definitely comes from the fact that my dad is actually a Scouser, which, along with Cockney, is one of those accents that is quite negatively stigmatized. And I'm really interested as to why. And I think partially growing up around like people speaking differently as to the way I was hearing things at school, for example, really influenced me.
So you're at Cambridge University, you're a researcher. What you've had? Do you want to share some details about your recent research subject, which I say generated a lot of national interest and coverage? What was the subject on?
The study was looking at accent prejudice in forensic contexts. So my more recent research background is actually in something called forensic phonetics, which is concerned with voice evidence in the criminal justice system in various different ways. And I was part of a big research project looking at improving how we understand what we call ear witnesses and their interaction with the criminal justice system. So an ear witness.
Ear witnesses, I'm fascinated.
Yeah, it's a great term. I really like it. It's sort of analogous to an eyewitness, but instead of seeing a perpetrator as either a witness or a victim of a crime, it describes how you have heard the voice of the perpetrator. And this is increasingly common nowadays, either because of crime that's conducted online or even over the phone, like fraud, but also because people do wear visual disguises in order to stop themselves being identified. But it's possible that you might have had an interaction with or overheard something, and you're asked to sort of later identify this person from something called a voice parade, which is the same thing as a visual lineup but with voices.
Yeah. Okay.
So
interesting that subject there and in depth there. And then so what then led you to the study?
So the study is looking at sort of understanding a little bit better how throughout the criminal justice system people hear voices and might make decisions about somebody or make an assumption about somebody based on the sound of their voice, and how that interacts with the criminal justice system, which can be complex and multifaceted. So, for example, you might have a witness providing testimony, and they have a particular regional accent, and the jury hears that voice and they make the assumption that this testimony is not trustworthy. It's not honest, and they might be making that assumption based on the sound of somebody's voice. Equally, if the ear witness that I described earlier was asked to listen to this parade of voices and pick out the perpetrator they heard before, they might, for one reason or another, pick out the wrong person, and they might be doing that because they assume that this person sounds guilty based on the sound of their voice. So we ran a series of studies, the first of which is the one that you've mentioned, which generated some media interest, which was, in particular, we were interested in how accent aligns with these prejudices. What assumptions do people make about how likely somebody is to commit a certain type of crime based on their accent?
So, as I say, from the mechanics of the study, because I think there was about 10 different accents. Do you want to run through the list as such, just so people are aware?
Yeah, of course.
Covered.
Yeah. I mean, we'll caveat this by saying that I know that there's variation within all of these accents. So, but we've got to start somewhere. And if we did, 100 different accents, then the experiment would be impossibly long. But the accents we decided to choose were from a geographically diverse range. So Cockney was one of our accents. Liverpool, Newcastle, Cardiff, Bradford, Birmingham, Bristol, Glasgow, Belfast, and what we in linguistics call SSBE. The general public might be more familiar with the term RP. In linguistics, they're two slightly different accents, but for the purposes of what we understand, they're basically the same thing. That's the posh BBC accent. Yeah.
So it's interesting then that you're studying globally the issue of accents, but also there must be variations within different accents, and different accents have different qualities and negatives associated with them.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we do know that the stronger, like the more overt a regional accent is, maybe the more entrenched some of these stereotypes are. And of course, within, say, for example, Glasgow, there will be a middle class accent, a more working class accent. But broadly speaking, around the UK, what's so interesting about this topic is that people have these really strongly entrenched ideas about what an accent says about somebody, in particular regarding like how intelligent or educated somebody is, when we know that that's just not objectively true at all. And what I'm really passionate about is understanding that people are that this says nothing about their intelligence, and that this kind of accent diversity is something that's really exciting and fascinating about the UK, but also that people are able and very competent at changing how they speak depending on what situation they're in, and that's a strength.
So is that there's a posh word for that, code switching? Is that?
Yeah.
Well, my dear old mum used to call it a telephone voice, but people much more sophisticated nowadays. Yeah. So what's so how did Cockney emerge from all this in terms of like perceptions?
Yeah. So you mean what were the results?
Yeah, like so in terms of so you've got the 10. I mean, so there's some interesting analysis about people's perceptions on Cockney and Cockney vis-a-vis the other accents. I mean, what sort of insights did you gain? Because as I found it fascinating reading your research study.
Well, the first kind of overall insight that we gained throughout the whole of the study was that the biggest predictor of how criminal a voice sounds is how working class it sounds. And so you could probably guess what I'm about to say next, because I'm sure anybody who knows anything about Cockney accents knows that it is associated with working class. So the Cockney accent was indeed perceived to be, out of the 10, the most working class sounding and the least educated sounding, and least intelligent sounding. Please don't shoot the messenger. It's important to do this research so that we know what these attitudes are, but also that it was strongly associated with lots of criminal and negative, antisocial behaviours, including, so we asked the listeners to rate sort of how likely is this person to commit these typical behaviours. And the London speaker, Cockney speaker, was most likely, or amongst the most likely rather, to physically assault someone, to cheat on a romantic partner, to lie on their CV, and to commit a sexual offence. Was less likely than some others, however, to commit the crimes of vandalism and shoplifting. The most likely to commit those particular crimes was actually the Liverpool speaker. But on a positive note, the London speaker was one of the most likely to return a lost wallet to its owner, which we designated as a morally good behaviour. I hope everybody sort of feels the same. And also the least likely, or amongst the least likely, to report a relative to the police for a minor offence. the grassing behavior, which I mean, I don't think anybody would be super surprised to hear that the most likely person was the posh SSBE, the RP speaker was the most likely to snitch on a relative. So overall, it's not a very positive picture, I will say, which is a real shame regarding the Cockney accent, and it does seem to pattern with other regional accents in the UK that have this kind of negative stigma about being working class, about being poorly educated. Yeah. So
in some ways, though, I mean, it's confirmed that many of people's suspicions about these things, and is brought to light, and also then reference to the court system and stuff there. So it strikes me as quite alarming that if I was to stand up in court speaking as I do, I've instantly got a sort of a handicap there, a challenge to overcome. I mean, so what sort of reaction did you get when you shared these findings, like from the legal profession and so on?
Yeah, actually, the legal professionals were really interested in this, in particular because it's something that is not currently enshrined in law. It's not a form of discrimination that is really acknowledged by the legal system, whether in an actual law or even in terms of like informing members of the jury or judges or lawyers or whoever that they should be aware of this kind of bias. And that's something we're really keen to establish, is some kind of warning that people should avoid this kind of discrimination, just as they would be warned to avoid discrimination based on race or gender or anything like that. So it seems that they are sort of keen to take on the advice and the sort of findings and implement them. Hopefully they are, at least. That seems to be the kind of attitude.
So it's really to be like mindful of this dimension of our internal biases and prejudices, our unconscious biases and so on.
That's completely it. Yeah, it's definitely, you know, to an extent it is conscious. In the UK we talk about accents a lot. People are very aware of them socially, and maybe in the way that they're not so aware in other countries. But it is also completely an unconscious thing. And yeah, what I would say is that also the other really important thing is that this can have an effect throughout the criminal justice system. It can be from the very moment of arrest or investigation all the way up to the sentencing, because regular, normal, everyday people just like you and I are involved in the criminal justice system. Police, lawyers, judges, juries are not going to be experts. They're not going to be sociolinguists, and they're not going to be thinking about this kind of thing in terms of mitigating against it unless they're asked to.
Yeah. So you mentioned about you doing some further studies and so on. Is this going to be the end of the road in terms of your analysis, or is this a stepping stone to more investigation?
It's definitely a stepping stone. We've conducted some other studies looking at how high pitched or low pitched you speak and how quickly you speak affects these same kind of judgments, and how it might interact with your accent as well. So that's the first sort of step. And then the next step after that was taking some voices that we already have some results for in terms of like being incorrectly picked from the voice parade scenario that I described to you earlier. So we had a lot of other experiments where we ran some voice parades, and we had some voices that stood out as sounding particularly guilty. And we really want to understand what is it about a voice that makes a voice sound guilty. That might be accent, but it might be many other things. So really that's the kind of next step that we're going to be taking.
Well, I mean, one possible request on my side, because you looked at a range of sort of antisocial behaviours. You didn't include racism, and from our campaign viewpoint, I mean, one of the big discoveries we made, we stumbled upon this issue that there's a tacit perception, you never see it in writing, that Cockney equals exclusively white working class with racist tendencies. And I'm quite fearful in an age of, say, social media, where we increasingly live in bubbles and echo chambers, that people would then define racist as, got a Cockney accent. So only media stereotypes what accent that I have. They have a Cockney accent and so on. And I just wonder, is there potential to explore that, or do you think that's too intricate to chat? I don't know, an area maybe that you don't want to take into.
It's something that we deliberately avoided, not because we aren't interested in that and don't think it's important, but because we know it needs to be carefully handled. Just because you have to be, there's just a lot of things you need to control, especially in an experimental scenario. We're always thinking about the tiny little details. And I think it deserves its own attention, rather than kind of being bundled in with these other negative behaviors, because there's so many other things that are tied in with that. I think, however, that just because it's complex doesn't mean that it shouldn't be looked at. People shouldn't be fearful of trying to tackle this topic, because it is extremely important. And I agree with you that it is maybe something that is sort of implicitly attached to certain accents in the UK. I'd be really interested to see that. It's not something we've had plans for per se in the project, but I'd love to see some research coming out about that.
So it's another thing on our task list that we can champion that cause of identity, because I'm fearful that if someone's then labelled a racist, there's then a host of other antisocial negative attributes attached to that. A question from Nigel in the chat there about what role do you think the mainstream media plays in the Cockney stereotype, in like reinforcing these types of negatives?
Yeah, a huge role, especially because you rarely see people in positions of sort of higher status in terms of, we'll say, for example, the newsreaders, for example. So we do have a really interesting phenomenon that has been gradually occurring over the last couple of decades, whereby we have more regional newsreaders with regional accents. Now, they're not usually particularly strong, but that's still an improvement in terms of representation in the media. But as far as I'm aware, I can't think of, please correct me if I'm wrong, a single mainstream news reader who has a strong Cockney accent. And often, that can play a big role in people's perceptions. I also think in terms of more fictional media, the example I always like to use is the Lord of the Rings or the Rings of Power series. There's a really strong stereotype kind of bucket that the characters get put into. So the elves speak with an RP accent, and the orcs speak with a Cockney accent, and the hobbits, they speak with either an Irish or a West Country accent, and then the dwarves, they're either Scottish or Welsh, and that plays to a kind of expectation that the audience has. But the more it's perpetuated, the more the more this continues. So it would be really interesting to see these kinds of massive mainstream media giants sort of take a little bit of a different tact with that, because it feels like a little bit of a lazy and easy trope to fall into. It's just not a very positive image of a Cockney speaker. The orcs, not only are they evil, but they're kind of ugly and they don't really have all that many redeeming qualities.
My self-esteem's shrinking every
yeah Listen, there's the other side of stereotypes, which is that like, oh, a bit stupid but nice, which is I mean, things could be worse, but it's still harmful. When you could, like, thinking, for example, about the hobbits, like, oh, a bit simple, but at least they're lovely and friendly and likable. But that's still a negative stereotype that's being attached to them. So I'd really like to see some kind of like moving away from those tropes.
Well, looking at the issue of what can we do, I think that's a good bridge to hand over now to Dr. Chris Strelluf. Can I call you Chris?
Yeah, I think we're on nickname terms, Andy.
Welcome, Chris. Now, we've got to declare that we've worked together with the Modern Cockney campaign over the last several years now. We've been extremely appreciative of your support and work. And really, maybe it's just a chance to sort of share what you've been doing that, Saif and I with the Modern Cockney Festival have seen at first hand, perhaps to a wider audience there, Chris. So can I really sort of say that First, a bit of a question I asked Alice. I mean, how do you explain to your sort of mum what a sociolinguist is?
Well, I mean, my mom is not particularly interested in what I do at this stage. I actually, if it's okay if I take a, is it okay if I share some slides?
Yeah, no, please,
I can illustrate what I'm actually interested in as a researcher, because it's quite what I am interested in here is talking about how sociolinguists and more broadly linguists can work in the kinds of public engagement based on the sort of research that people like Alice are doing, which also in turn has implications for ways that people who are outside academia might think of engaging academics in public impact and social impact sorts of research projects. So the slide on the screen is actually the kind of thing I'm interested in. Alice mentioned identity as an important issue in sociolinguistics, but I'm actually at my heart less interested in things like that and more interested in big picture stuff about what we can learn about how the human brain makes and processes language. So the slide following you is from a speaker born in Coventry in the 1920s, and the red triangles are words that would be pronounced with a foot vowel in Southern British English dialects, and the words in the kind of gold brown font are words that would be pronounced with a strut vowel in Southern British English dialects. And of course, this is a major dialect boundary feature in British Englishes. And I work primarily in American Englishes rather than British Englishes. But what I would be interested in this data set is, does this show that in Coventry there was a one vowel Northern system or a two vowel British system? Does it show that that's changed over time? And how, if there has been change or stability, what does that tell us about children growing up in this area and how they hear the language around them, how they perceive it, and how they build their own language system? Because language isn't transmitted from generation to generation by parents teaching children language. So that's actually what I'm interested in. And the interest in this project for me that I will try to say is interesting to other people is how, for linguists who aren't working in obviously social issues like the work Alice is doing in terms of justice and accents, how we can still commit to social good. I think I jumped on you there, Andy.
Yeah, no problem. As I say, I was allowed interjecting there. So this participatory, what do you mean by that, Chris?
So participatory research is a strain of research that's interested in engaging non-academic audiences in the research processes with an aim toward a liberatory agenda, where it's not just academics helicoptering and descending into communities and telling them truth. And this is core to the sorts of work that you'll hear in sociolinguistics and linguistics generally, because linguists recognize that they need to contribute to public dialogues around issues. And that's the sort of theme attested to in these quotes from Mark Lieberman, who's a prominent public engagement figure in linguistics. And it's especially central to the historical ethos of our field of sociolinguistics, where leading scholars in the field have identified that because as linguists we get our data from speech communities, we have ethical obligations as researchers to identify errors and correct those in the public record when we recognize them as a part of our research project, to use research to improve the lives of people in the speech communities that we're working in, and indeed as expanded by Wolfram in the principle of linguistic gratuity, that we actually need to be proactive in doing these things. So we don't just passively look for opportunities to use sociolinguistic research for good, but actually we create some of these opportunities. And this has taken a number of forms in sociolinguistics, some of which consider the roles of the people in the speech communities where we get our language data from, and empowering them to do more work. And this theme of ethical good with our work and empowering communities gets to the answer to your question, Andy, in aligning with a theme in participatory research where non-academic communities, the people who traditionally academics have researched, take a role and are given authority and agency in academic research processes. And this is often framed as turning academic-driven research toward equitable shared decision-making in research projects. And there's a million names that this goes under, and these are very much tied to different fields, use different labels. So I'll mention some things on participatory research and citizen science, which are some labels that get thrown around a lot. This is a model of participatory research. So this is from the International Association for Public Participation, and it suggests this continuum where we move from heavy researcher control on the informed side to the left of the screen to shared decision-making between the researched communities and academic researchers on the right in the empower column. This model, which comes from industry, has also been adopted into the literature on participatory research. And so this is that model converted into an academic model, which was the first article of the Journal of Participatory Research, so a field and a publication devoted to the study of participatory research as a field. And so we have these kind of concentric circles moving from academic researcher dominance in the center to shared ownership and shared decision-making on the extremes. But what I'm kind of interested in this project and the work that we've done together, Andy Saif and other colleagues, is whether we can critique more the role that these participatory models, where they actually place power between researchers and researched communities. And I've excerpted a couple of examples here to highlight, and these aren't bad projects by any means, but that they illustrate a point that I want to make about power and control under participatory research. And that's in this case, what I've highlighted is following these designs of participatory action research, the researchers, quote, designed a project where participants completed transformative actions. And so what I'm highlighting there is that the agency in this decentralized democratic model is the researchers still design a project, and then under the lens of participatory, give community members, the researched population, agency in making decisions about what the researchers have done. This shows up in citizen science as well, which is often touted as a participatory research model. This is from a linguistics clearinghouse where scholars, researchers can post linguistic projects and invite public contribution and participation. But still, in terms of the power, the starting point here is a researcher was interested in something, they designed a project, and then they invite people from the community, researched communities, to participate in it. So very much the starting point of this is still researchers who are then sharing power rather than really decentralizing. And in fact, kind of the whole research framework of United Kingdom higher education is based around this model, that even research that is intended to do good and to be democratic and liberatory still starts with academic research and then invites participation or invites pathways for impact that research could have. This is particularly true in the research excellence framework that the United Kingdom uses every 7 years. So what I want to do in this is critique this continuum and suggest that there should be more stuff to the right of this to invite greater liberation in research and in sociolinguistic research, specifically so that we can meet the ideals of sociolinguistics, meeting the principle of linguistic gratuity, the principle of error correction, the principle of debt incurred. And suggest we do this by coming up with more genuine ways that continue to move beyond sharing and decision-making with people who are researched and actually turn leadership over research projects to the communities where researchers can offer contributions rather than researchers starting those to make those contributions. And what I suggest here is that this continuum can have kind of two further levels where rather than the end of participatory research being a researcher designs a project and community members share in decision makings, we can further shift this to a point where community members, people in traditionally researched communities, actually initiate and start the projects, and academic researchers just look for ways that their insight can inform that and offer it, but don't steer the process. And then that also suggests there should be a further step where communities, traditionally researched communities, just do the work themselves, and academic researchers in sociolinguistics and other fields just learn from the work they do. This also creates a reciprocal relationship between academic researchers and researched communities, because at the most academic research-centric level of inform, community members are learning from those researchers. And on the other side, at the most researched person-centric level, academics are just learning from the community and being informed by community members. So what I suggest is that in work that we've done and shared in this venue before, but now I can kind of talk to how that model bears out. I'd like to suggest ways that manifests itself in the Cockney Blueprint you mentioned earlier, Andy. So the Cockney Blueprint was a publication that Andy Saif and I collaborated on in support of Tower Hamlets after a community petition to Tower Hamlets to recognize Cockney as part of its community languages program, which I think Tower Hamlets sort of flipped out about a bit about, because they thought they'd be teaching children rhyming slang and this sort of thing. And what we offered instead was a model of using sociolinguistic research, not that I'd personally done as a scholar, but drawing on work like what Alice and her colleagues have done to inform what that plan could look like and give a sociolinguistically guided approach to recognizing Cockney as a historical heritage language within Tower Hamlets. So we undertook a project where we did a lot of interviews with people in Tower Hamlets to get their experiences and perspectives on their identity as Cockney, their experiences with language and potentially speakers of stereotyped or stigmatized languages. We constructed a research-informed argument about the linguistics of Cockney that drew on historical sociolinguistics in the case of highlighting how modern-day stigmas around Cockney and the meaning that Cockney has as a label today emerged, what the actual sound system, grammatical, and word level features of Cockney were, and what research, like what Alice and her colleagues have done on language prejudice, tells us about the effects of language ideologies on speakers of those languages. We also, and you and Andy and Saif were certainly leaders on this, drew on the experiences of people in Tower Hamlets to identify the links between an identity of Cockney or experiences identifying as a speaker of Cockney or speaking Cockney or other stigmatized languages, and what that meant in terms of positive social traits and identities that people draw on, as well as negative experiences that are imposed on people. And we use that to come up with a series of teaching activities that could be implemented, not as Tower Hamlets initially thought to teach children rhyming slang, but rather to give people a grounding in sociolinguistic principles and principles of language ideology, ways to study language the way a linguist does, to be empowered through that knowledge. And then we created a series of sociolinguistically and linguistically informed goals for Tower Hamlets to use to envision in implementing Cockney as a part of its community languages program. So what I want to suggest we were able to do is, by challenging the idea that the starting point for sociolinguistic impact should be researchers do a project and then find partners and stakeholders in ways that can be supported, which is often a model that's preferred in the United Kingdom and in the literature around liberatory models of research, like participatory research, and instead started from the standpoint of a community has an issue and has brought a political and policy decision to the fore. How can sociolinguistic research inform that and help that shape that into something that's scientifically valid and helps us move towards social justice? I think that model of participatory research offers us new directions to make meaningful change, and can be very empowering in creating relationships that do useful things between members of communities that might traditionally be researched academic researchers who are doing this sort of work. And so I suggest that this is a valuable model for us to think about as we think about the ways that sociolinguistics can work to do public good through changing that conceptualization of what participation in research means. So thanks for letting me talk at you, and now I can shut up.
I mean, so when Saif and I, we thought we were just being gobby Cockneys to you, but you were actually engaged in participatory research in terms of engaging with us, listening, coming from where we're at, and beginning our journey that way. So some fascinating insights there, and you know, so really, it's been both of you, Alice and Chris, have been, you know, wonderful in terms of building this bridge between social change, but real social change is much more powerful. That's fully informed. As you know, it's got a facts truth on its side, and can be a powerful force for greater social justice there. So some powerful stuff there. So I mean, in terms of what we've shared then, so does it strike you as strange? I mean, I'm very frustrated with our Modern Cockney campaign that there's none of the public bodies we engage with don't seem to have any policies regard accents. You know, they've all got sort of policies on inclusivity and stuff like that, but it's almost as if we're inclusive, but as soon as people open their mouth, then there's a whole new regime kicks in, which is a real instrumental dimension in how people interact and put other people down. So, so we've got really sort of a way ahead through research and study, B, a way ahead through participatory research, but do sociolinguists, maybe a bit provocative, do sociolinguists need to do more to make more impact on the world around them? I mean, is it a fair criticism to say you're not doing enough? I mean, Alice or Chris to respond.
I think often academics are criticised, you know, that whole sort of ivory tower image of doing research that isn't relevant and you know, it's maybe just not realistic. But I think increasingly sociolinguistics is a discipline that is often people's first experience of linguistics. It's often, for example, students taking English language at A level, they will have an introduction to sociolinguistics, and it's the kind of thing that people are interested in. So in the sense that it gets people engaged and talking about language, talking about discrimination and things like that, I think that is a really important piece of work that sociolinguists do and are doing a really great job at. Access and widening participation, getting young people interested in it so that they can become part of the conversation as well. But I do think, yeah, that the more we get the message out about like raising awareness that this is an issue that can have real world implications, the better. And I think, you know, that's something that is becoming more and more of a focus for sociolinguists nowadays. Yeah.
And Chris, about you, what's your views, mate?
I mean, I think we've had quite a few successes. I mean, I think in general, so this will be a slightly provocative statement. I think across academia, all fields need to continue to engage with how we achieve justice, because there's been a huge amount of work from the 1960s forward in shifting academia out of the ivory tower toward making society better. And some of these things misfire or are not critically engaged enough. So an example of that is, as we mentioned, unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is a concept that comes out of American psychology in the 1950s. And a lot of the perpetuation of unconscious bias is driven because it's an easy concept to package. You can put it into a corporate training module. You can run all your employees through a 2-hour session on unconscious bias, and then the company can say, okay, we've made everybody unbiased. Cultural theorists are critical of that shift to unconscious bias. One, because it's highly US centric. Two, and much more profoundly, because it suggests that everything exists in the individual mind and not in the culture, and doesn't take into account what people know about their culture, what people have to know about their culture to engage with it. And we're increasingly seeing backlash in really horrible ways in the context of the United States against some of those initiatives that we've tried to do that haven't really worked. And the evidence in the case of unconscious bias is it doesn't work. It makes people who engage in the training resentful. It doesn't actually move the needle. So you have a case where a lot of money's been spent on something that doesn't actually contribute to the liberation of people. So I actually think, if we're talking about sociolinguistics, I think we've done a huge amount of good. I mean, some of this work, the starting point for a lot of this work was Bill Labov challenging highly discriminatory educational theory in the 1960s that African-American children were intellectually deficient on the basis of linguistic evidence that was really problematically and racistly corrected. And Labov challenged that, refuted that, and that language deficit model has disappeared. There's been strides from research that John Baugh led in recognizing the role of accent bias in housing discrimination. Of course, as Alice mentioned, there's much more attention now to representing lots of accents on media. So I think actually sociolinguists have done great work. But in academia as a whole, there's a lot of concepts that we're still trying to get around. And I think models like participatory research need to be critiqued more to get us to achieving the kinds of impacts that we're morally obligated to achieve.
I've got some good questions emerging from the room. Aidan asked, explain the class difference in the perceived likelihood to snitch on a relative. So what would explain those differences you found among to begin with?
I think there's this kind of stereotype that working class people have a kind of loyalty and a sense of protecting one another and standing up for one another, that the more wealthy middle class RP speaker, for example, doesn't have in the same way. I think that has a lot to do with power structures and who's willing to throw somebody else under the bus to advance themselves. That actually links, interestingly, I would say, to another interesting finding of ours, which was that although being perceived as working class, broadly speaking, increased your chances, or the speaker's chances, of being perceived as criminal, there was one particular crime where that wasn't the case, and that was actually the sexual offence. So we saw that consistently for all of the other crimes, the RP speaker was the least likely to be accused of that crime. But for the sexual offence, it was not. And I think that again speaks to a question of power dynamics, status, and also more broadly, like, what is the perception, this stereotyped image we have in like the media, for example, of high profile cases of people who've been accused of sexual offences, and people who have, for example, maybe not snitched on a relative to the police, but the kind of person who may have betrayed somebody close to them. It's that image of somebody who has power and wants power and is willing to do something to keep it.
Any observations there, Chris, about sort of variations in working class behaviours?
I mean, there's a complexity to stigmatized language that the old sociolinguistic research distinguishes between covert and overt prestige. And so, covert prestige is things like solidarity, positive social attributes like friendliness. And so we see these things. It's tempting in kind of media discourses to talk about accent discrimination, but it also has these really complex ways that a language variety that's stigmatized, or behaviors that are stigmatized in some ways, will also be positively viewed in others. And so yeah, there's this covert prestige that, yeah, you may be a criminal, but at least you're an honorable one. But as Alice says, those sorts of those still represent ideologies, and they're still limiting and diminishing to speakers.
We've got another question in the room about, do you know of any question templates to monitor for accent discrimination? So really, what sort of tools are out there to help, overcome this challenge? Alice?
I don't personally know of any. I know of some projects that are working to foreground this kind of prejudice and build it into systems in this kind of way. For example, Accent Bias Britain. There's a really interesting project up in Edinburgh called, I think it's called the 1% Project or something, which is about accent bias in academic settings. So yeah, the short answer is no, but that people are working towards implementing this kind of thing.
Well, on a personal basis, I mean, in your journey becoming a sociolinguist, and you're then aware of like learning and discovering like there's issues, and oh my God, I'm guilty of that as well sometimes. What sort of self-discipline things did you, accommodate or do to overcome your own recognized biases?
Yeah, I mean, not sure. I guess the most important thing is that I'm interested in variation for variation's sake, and I try to see everything that is different to what I'm expecting or unusual as a source of new information for me. Like, wow, that's interesting, rather than, oh, I didn't expect to hear that and I don't like it. That's how I'd like everybody to approach accents. But there's a lot of, as Chris mentioned, a lot of cultural baggage that comes along with it that is actually a little bit more overt than covert, and a lot of undoing of prejudices that needs to be done as well.
But just on a personal question, I mean, you mentioned about your father got a Scouse accent. How did your sort of relationship with him sort of grow or develop with the more knowledge you gained from sociolinguists and so on? Was there a
it's really interesting because when I was younger, he definitely had a stronger accent. And I mentioned he works in the diplomatic service. You can imagine there's a bit of pressure there to conform to a particular type of way of speaking. And I'd say now you'd probably, unless you're an expert, struggle to tell that he is from Liverpool. And I have spoken to him about this more recently because I've become so much more interested in it. Asked him whether he felt like, kind of on a conscious level, this pressure to conform. And he said he didn't think so, but, that it's very possible that might be the case. His siblings, who obviously grew up in the same environment as him, still speak with a strong Scouse accent. So it's made me kind of think about, what other pressures might he have been subject to when he was working in that environment, and is that why he speaks this way, or is it, I don't know, just because he's been away from Liverpool for a really long time?
So Chris, I mean, your sort of mindfulness about discrimination, I mean, any sort of tips or things you go through to stop like bias creeping into your objectivity there?
Well, I mean, I didn't mean for this to be the session where I bang on about unconscious bias, but I mean, part of the critique against the concept, the academic veracity of unconscious bias is that you should be able to become under unconscious bias training, you should be able to become aware that a bias exists in your brain and then get it out of your brain. And I think the cultural critique of that is that you actually can't. So where I come from in the United States, we're not that far from the South, which is a highly stigmatized region in the United States. And no matter how long I'm a sociolinguist, if somebody says I sound like I'm from the South, it bothers me. So you can't overcome your culture, or at least the culture that you are enculturated into. You always still carry that around. But as Alice says, if we sort of identify those things and recognize them, and then separate the innate reaction from the intellectual reaction, maybe that helps. So problematically, it still bothers me with my parents when my mom says y'all now, as she's started doing, because it's a thing that Trumpy Americans seem to do. it does make my skin crawl, but
we now know how to wind you up now, mate. Oh, be careful.
yeah.
Just conscious of the time, just as we're concluding, are you optimistic about the future that there will be a greater understanding of these biases in accents, and that sociolinguists can play a more active role in addressing these social issues? I mean, looking ahead, I mean, are you more of an optimist or a sort of a pessimist that, you know, you do your bit, but it's not, nothing's going to change?
I don't know. I mean, I personally feel pretty optimistic just because I think it's becoming more a part of the kind of public discourse. People are becoming more aware of it, and the more people are aware of it, the more they just like check themselves, you know, like Chris was mentioning, sort of like, yeah, you maybe can't ever get rid of the kind of gut reaction, but you can at least check yourself that you're not imposing that in a way that's detrimental. And I think, yeah, the more we talk about it, and it seems to be much more in the kind of news and the media recently, that's really positive. And yeah, like I say, from a perspective like in the criminal justice system, you know, we're just a small team, but we're trying our best to enshrine this, and I know we're not the only ones. So I feel relatively optimistic.
What about you, Chris?
Yeah, ditto.
Yeah, but if I can share a story before we go separate ways, when I was at school, our class register consisted of shouting out a number. And unfortunately for me, I changed schools and I got the last number in the class. And for me, it was 33, or 33, as the young Andy Green would say. And I remember Miss Golding getting me up in front of the class, walloping me around the head and going, "Green, it's 33. So I think gladly we don't live in that world anymore, but equally we do live in a world of increasing social bubbles. So there's challenge and major tasks ahead of us. But I'm really glad you guys are both here doing what you're doing, and long may you keep more power to your elbows in going forward. So can we please a virtual thank you to everyone in the room. I'm going to be hanging around for another 5 minutes or so if anyone wants to have a chatter and natter. Oh, I must get our plugs in for our forthcoming event, otherwise Mark in the room will kill me. So bear with me a second here. So just coming up shortly, we have next two major events coming up. So a week Thursday, a live event, Poetry for Togetherness, with some great poets, the legendary comedian, broadcaster and definer of Cockney, Arthur Smith, on in Dalston. So a great live event there, promoting the theme of togetherness and launching a national poetry competition. Again, all looking about how poetry, like sociolinguists, can be a theme, a method, a tool for bringing society together. And then we'll finish up really at the Museum of the Home, where I know we've got one of the directors in the audience, where Saif will be leading a workshop of designing a Cockney kilt. Apologies for any Scots people in the audience. And we've got the Pearly King of Woolwich sharing the rhyming slang for kids. A really great fun out for a day for all the family. And again, really sort of flying the flag for being proud, empowered by the culture that you share there. And then really, as anyone further reading, we've got from our website, apologies there, 1 second there. We've got two documents to, just bear with me a second, my PowerPoint has gone away there. Right, so bear with me a second. And two documents, very important ones to share before we go our separate ways. The Modern Cockney Manifesto really explains our mission, and Chris has referenced the Cockney Blueprint for Tower Hamlets, which serves as a brilliant model for any public body of how to engage in delivering Cockney as a community language, and also really any other non-standard English as a way ahead. So really can we thank you from the Modern Cockney Festival for being here today. Thank you to our guest speakers. We're still going to have a linger around for a natter, and thank you, and hope to see you at future events. And as I say, keep being proud of who you are and celebrate who you are. And as Bob Hoskins' mum once said, if people don't like you, F them, they've got no taste. So on that note, should we go forward? Anyway, thank you, everyone. And as I say, anyone wants to have a chat, we're here for a couple of minutes. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Chris, mate. And thank you, Nigel, as well, for the doorman.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andy. Enjoy the rest of the festival.
Alice, thank you so much again, and keep up your great work there. Really powerful, and a great presentation as well today.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Dad to start the Modern Scouser Festival.
I know. I wish he would. He wouldn't be a great leader for it. I don't think anyone would believe he's actually Scouse, but maybe I'll get one of his brothers to do it instead.
Yeah, take care. It's lovely to see you.
Take care. Bye.
And Chris, we've got our call on Thursday, mate. I hope all okay there, mate. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. Talk to you then, mate.
Okay, mate. Take care.
Bye. I say.
So I hope anyone in the room still wants an add, are more than welcome to join in. And David Kelly at the Museum and Home, we're looking forward to doing our gig there, mate. And what a brilliant museum that is there as well in Hoxton Station. But I've got a secret. I'm going to sneak out at lunchtime, David, around the corner to Cooks's Pie Mash Shop, the most authentic pie mash shop in London, in my humble opinion. Lisa, did you enjoy the talk? Then have you got a moment to have a quick word?
Yeah, I love that. It's always I've been to a few of these now, and it's really energizing for me.
Yeah,
partly to hear the accents.
And where are you calling from, Lisa?
I'm in Cornwall.
Cornwall, there. Right. Yeah, it was a lovely part of the world, and in fact, was speaking at an online event the other month, a bit in Bodmin.
Yeah.
Yeah, like our Bodmin's got this issue about identity and stuff, and really that a suggestion we're making about our identity is a wardrobe now rather than a single item of clothing, sort of thing. I might use that phrase. I like that one. Anyway, but thank you so much, Lisa, for coming along and being there and being supportive of what we do. So it's very much appreciated.